Today we're going to turn our attention to metaphysics, and we're going to look at schemes of categories. This is a natural thing. One of the basic questions of metaphysics, maybe the basic question is, what is there? What kinds of things are there? What is the world ultimately made up of? And so we're going to be considering that question and looking at answers in the form of a theory of categories. Well, the things that are of these kinds. And so we're going to start by looking at Aristotle's theory of categories, but then we're going to move on to look at an alternative categorical scheme from ancient India to try to get the idea of what kind of issues arise when we begin to think about the question of what there is. Well, let's begin by thinking about Aristotle's categories. This is the beginning of the Greek text of a work called The Categories. And he presents this theory here, but also in the Metaphysics. Now here are Aristotle's categories. There are 10 of them. The first is substance. As examples, man, the horse, Socrates. And we're going to talk a lot more about what substance is. The second, club. Things like 6 feet tall, or 235 square miles, the area of Austin, for example. Quality. Things like white, tall, angry, wise. Relations like double or greater than. Or for that matter, loves, is interested in, etc. Place, at the mall, west of Austin, in Athens. Time, today, at noon, for a week. Sometimes these are moments of time, sometimes intervals of time. Positions like lying, sitting, standing. Some of these are states like are or puzzled or impressed. Some are actions like hit, smile, do, walk, thank. And then others are affections, things that are done to one. So to be hit, to be thanked. Now, that's kind of an interesting answer, but what's the question, okay? If we start with the question, what is there, and then we see this as an answer, I guess that's one sort of answer, right? There are substances, there are quantities, there are qualities. There are relations, there are places, times, positions, states, actions, and affections. And so that is one way of answering this question, what is it? But at first glance, it's maybe not the kind of thing you were expecting. You might have been expecting, like people and inanimate objects and plants and animals and blah, 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 blah. Or maybe you were expecting an answer like protons and neutrons and electrons and so forth. But this isn't that kind of answer. It's a different sort of answer. And so a natural question arises. What are these categories of? Now, it's an answer to a question, but also these are categories. It's a classification scheme, but a classification scheme of what? What are we classifying? What are we grouping into these basic groupings? Now, I really want to ask you that question. These are categories, but what are they categories of? What do you think Aristotle is classifying? Do you have any associations with that list at all? In a way, it is strange, because normally a philosopher raises a question, then ultimately gives you an answer to it. In this case, it's more like we get the answer, and we have to figure out what the question was, if that's an answer too. Yeah?
They're like ways that you would describe something. They're like categories of ways that you can describe something.
Okay, good. Ways that you could describe a thing. So that would be one thing we could think about. We were expecting maybe categories of things, but that's not what we really get here. Maybe we get a categorization of descriptions of things. Any other ideas? Yeah?
Intangible things.
Intangible things? Okay. Yeah, intangible things. Some of these things seem tangible, like a horse or Socrates, but some of them don't, like to be thanked, or at the mall, or west of Austin, or between noon and 1, and so on. Those seem intangible things, right? They're in some sense things. But if I say, give me some examples of things, what does thing apply to in English? Your first thought is tangible things, right? Like this hand, or that notebook, or a table, and so forth. You don't tend to think about, what are some examples of things? Like being thanked, or hitting somebody, or, being west of Austin. Those are strange answers, but intangible answers. And so one way you could look at this is to say, it's trying to give you a categorization of the intangible things as well as the tangible things. Can you think of another way of trying to understand what he's up to. Yeah.
This might be kind of vague, but it seems like he's trying to map out elements of being.
Elements of being, okay, exactly. He's thinking about, after all, what there are, and so he's thinking, well, something can be, and now, it can be a man, it can be Socrates, but it can also be 6 feet tall. It can also be lasting from noon to 1 p.m. It can also be thanked, it can be thanking, it can be all those things. So indeed, one way of answering this is to say a kind of thing, tangible or intangible. But another possibility is to say, well, a kind of basic thing. Notice he doesn't start saying, oh, there are oak trees and maple trees and cats and raccoons and so on. But here's another possibility, it's kinds of being. You can be what? What could follow? Socrates is something. Socrates is a man. Socrates is sitting down. Socrates is kicking a ball. Socrates is being thanked. Socrates is, well, west of Athens, let's say. So it could be kinds of being. Now notice these things correspond to grammatical functions. That is to say, for each of these categories that Aristotle lists, it's pretty obvious what kind of grammatical function goes along with it. Let's go back to those categories. Substance, man, the horse, Socrates, what are those grammatically speaking? They're nouns, right? And what does a noun stand for? Well, person, place, or thing, classically. Quantity, what about things like that? 6 feet tall, 235 square miles. Good, they're all measurements, right? They're things that are numerical measures of something. What about qualities? White, tall, angry, wise. What are those grammatically speaking? Adjectives, right. Relations like double or greater than. Sort of comparative adjectives, right? They're a special kind of adjective. What about places like at the mall or west of Austin? In Athens. They're prepositional phrases, right? What about times like today at noon for a week?
Durations.
Yeah, well, they all have to do with duration or location and time. They're either adverbs or adverbial phrases. What about positions like lying, sitting, standing? Well, they're a particular form of a verb, right? They're a verb participle. What about armed, puzzled, impressed? They're also forms of a verb, right? But in this case, or a gerund form of a verb. What about hit, smile, do, walk, thank? They're verbs in the active voice. What about to be hit, to be thanked? Verbs in the passive voice. Okay, I can see that your knowledge of grammar fades quickly after nouns and adjectives. But anyway, yeah, each of these corresponds to a certain kind of grammatical category. And you might think, okay, so one way of looking at what he's doing is to say these are kinds of grammatical category. But I think the underlying thought, never really fully explicitly articulated by Aristotle, but we'll talk about it a lot more next time, is that the structure of language reveals the structure of the world. And so these grammatical distinctions correspond to distinctions in the kinds of being. And that corresponds to the kinds of thing, understood in this very broad sense that includes all sorts of intangible things as well as tangible things. So let's go back to talking about substance. There is a sense in which the very first category, substance, is by far the most important. Because Aristotle says everything else depends on the category of substance. A quality is something that adheres in a substance. So something is white, something or someone is tall, something or someone is sitting down, something or someone is to the west of Austin, and so on and so forth. All of these categories are ultimately things that apply to substance. Someone might be thanked, someone might be thanking someone else. It's always a substance that's involved in these relations that has these qualities. We talk about quantities or measurements of substances. So all of those depend, in a certain sense, on substance. Now, he does say there are many senses in which a thing can be said to be. And that suggests that what we've really got here are kinds of being. Kinds of being. But all of them depend, he says, on one particular focal meaning of being, namely substance. What is, in the primary sense, substance, or substances? Now, this idea of a focal meaning is something Aristotle uses a lot. For example, we talk about a lot of things being healthy or unhealthy. We can talk about foods being healthy or unhealthy. We can talk about exercise or forms of exercise as healthy or unhealthy. But in the end, really, all of those connect to health, and all of them connect to people being healthy or unhealthy. After all, a healthy food is one that tends to make a person healthy. An unhealthy form of exercise is one that, if practiced, tends to make a person unhealthy. And so, all of those tie to the health or lack of health in a person, and all of them are derivative from that. And so we might say similarly here, all of these are ways in which something can be. It can be tall, it can be west of Austin, it can be twice as old as something else, and so on. But in the end, it's always the being of substance that is fundamental, and that the others derive from. Well, what is a substance? Intuitively speaking, a substance is a thing. It's an object. It's a this. I can point to it. So I can say, this thing, substance, okay? It also answers a question, what is it? And so really, it's not just a this. After all, if you say, what is that? And I say, it's this. That's not much of an answer. So we can't just say it's a this. We've got to say a little bit more. It does answer the question, what is that? Now, it would be very strange if someone walked into the room we haven't seen before, and somebody said, who is that? And I said, he's walking. Right? That's a weird sort of answer. Or, he's in the classroom. That doesn't answer your question, who is that? If you see something very strange, right? A friend who's taking biology is looking through a microscope and says, come over here, look at this. And you look in and you see something green moving around. And you say, what is that? It'd be strange if they answered, I'll tell you what it is, it's moving around. It's green. It's like, yeah, I know that, but what is it? So substance involves answering that sort of question. What is it? And we don't do that in terms of other categories. If I just tell you how it's moving, or how it's being moved, or what quality it has, or how it measures in various respects, I'm not answering the question, what is it? Well, what this tells us is that a substance is always of a kind. It is always a this, a particular thing, but also always of a certain kind. Now, we can distinguish two kinds. Some kinds are quite specific, and others are more general. So, for example, I point to this, and I say, what is this? It's a table, right? And that's its specific kind. But I can be more general than that, too. What is a table? Well, it's a kind of furniture. What is furniture? Gee, I don't know. What is furniture? He says, well, it's sort of a tool, it's sort of a decoration. Yeah, but I don't hang a painting on the wall and say, there's some new furniture. Nor do I pick up a hammer and say, oh, this is a piece of furniture. So it's more specific than that. Actually, defining, well, we saw it was really hard to define chair. And remember, one of our initial very unclear definitions was, well, it's kind of furniture. But furniture isn't any easier, right? It's sitting around our houses, but we don't know what it is. That's sort of strange. Anyway, it's got something that is a specific kind. It's got a general kind that it exemplifies. But the substance, in the primary sense anyway, is the this. So one way that Aristotle sometimes puts it is that a substance is a this such. It is a this, a particular thing, but also a such. That is to say, it's of a certain kind. It's like this table, that chair, that person, this computer. Those are examples of substances. There's a particularity to it, this or that, but also it's of a certain kind. Well, substance then is what really exists in the primary sense. So we finally come around to really the central question of metaphysics, what is there? And his answer is, well, in some sense, a lot of things, but really in the primary sense, substance. Substances are what exists, or at least substance. Now, should I say substance, or should I say substances? That's something that we have to figure out. If it's a this such, it looks like there are lots of different thises, many different tables, for example. So in the primary sense, I think the right answer here is really substances. However, It's tricky because it depends on exactly what the character of substance is. So our first attempt at the answer, what is there? Answer, substance. But now we've got to think, well, what is that really? There are two kinds, two ways in which we might speak of substance. We've already seen the primary one. It's a this, such. It is a subject of predication. Usually the subject of a sentence refers to a substance. Now, not always. Sometimes it refers to an event. Like losing the battle was devastating to the general. That's something that isn't really a substance in the primary sense. However, typically, we talk about the table being brown, for example. Or we say Dan Bottomax is talking. We're attributing something to a substance. And so usually, the subject of the sentence refers to a substance. It is a subject of which we predicate other things. A substance that we measure, or hold in relation to something else, or describe as having a certain quality, and so on. We predicate, in short, other things of it. We talk about the table, and then we talk about various things that are true of the table. Or a person, and things that are true of the person. So the primary substances are just things, objects, individual substances. And people and animals and plants and so on are included among them. So indeed, if we start thinking about these individual substances in the primary sense, and say, well, what are interesting divisions? A big division will be between the things that are living and non-living, and then another between the things that are animate and inanimate, and then among the animals, those things that are rational and those that are not rational, and so on. Now, there is also a sense in which we can talk about substance in terms of the kinds, in terms of the suches, really. And we can talk about this kind of thing. So I might say, yeah, it's useful to have this kind of thing around. And I'm talking about tables, right? Not just this individual table. So we could also use this such locution in reference to a kind of thing. And that's a sort of secondary sense. So he refers to kinds as secondary substances. We predicate things of kind as well as of individual substances. So for example, if you look up something like elm tree in the dictionary, or just elm, it will say a kind of deciduous tree found in North America. Elm, it takes us denoting a kind of thing. Or, here's another example. Often we use bare plurals in language. Plural nouns with no all or some or five or anything like that along with them. And those things are usually understood as referring to kinds. So if I say tigers are striped, I'm talking about the kind tiger. Philosophy majors are smart. I'm talking about the kind philosophy major. So sometimes these kinds are natural kinds. They're things that are just found in nature, in the way you might find a tiger in nature. That's a kind of thing, independently of our ways of thinking about it. But on the other hand, philosophy majors, that's a sort of categorization we have, that we've devised. It's not like you go out into the wild to find philosophy majors in the jungles of Borneo. Okay, well, anyway. A substance is then of this such. But how do we recognize that? What are some criteria for establishing that something is or is not a substance? Aristotle gives us a couple of these. By the way, the drawing there is of Aristotle teaching Alexander. So, here's his first. There are no degrees of substance. There are degrees of other kinds of things. Let's say tall, a quality. There are degrees of being tall. You can be tall. For example, am I tall? Don't worry, I won't be insulted. I'm actually sort of in a vague, I'm not short, I'm not really tall. I'm a little taller than average, but not much taller than average. I'm 5'11". I'm really very short for my family. All the other men in my family are much taller. But I blame my mother, who was both very ill and smoked during her pregnancy with me. But in any event, there are degrees of tallness. Am I tall? Kind of tall, not really tall. My brother is 6'4". He's tall, okay? But on the other hand, last time I was in Los Angeles, I was looking around at the airport for one of those screens, the TV type screens that tell you about flight times and all of that. And I look over, and everybody else is looking like this. And there's one guy who is like, his head is well above everybody else in the crowd, and he's just looking at it straight on. Okay? I was like, that guy is tall. Okay? And indeed, then a bunch of people start crowding around him, and I begin to realize, oh, he's a star for the Los Angeles Kings. But I didn't know that. It was just like, dude, wow, that guy's tall. And he's really, I mean, I'm used to seeing tall people, but not that tall, not like basketball star tall. And so there are degrees of that kind of thing. The same thing is true with quantities, right? We talk about measuring something, and you can have various degrees. So it's like, how hot is it today? According to my watch, it's currently 88, but it feels like 94 or something. And then later by the end of the afternoon, it'll be in the mid-90s, so it'll get hotter, and so forth. There are degrees of all of that. What about being west of Austin? Are there degrees of that? Sure, right? You can be a little west of Austin, or really far west of Austin. How about, now not always, maybe, at the mall. Can you be sort of at the mall? I don't know, maybe. If you're like in the parking lot? I'm not sure about some of those things. But typically there are degrees of these things. But notice there are no degrees of substance. Okay, I am a human being. Is somebody else more a human being than I? Is it like, well, that guy's kind of a human being, but that guy's really human? No, I mean, if you're a person, you're just a person. So there aren't degrees of being a person. Or what about a cat? Can you say, yeah, I've got this thing that's kind of a cat. And of course, it's not really a cat. Your cat's really catty. I mean, mine is just kind of, sort of a cat. And that cat, that's hardly a cat at all. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? That's incoherent. And what about this table? Can I say, well, this is a little bit of a table, but some other things are really tables. They're way tabler than this. No, I mean, there aren't really degrees of being a substance. Either you're an object or you're not. You can be taller or less tall, right? You can't really be either more of a thing or less of a thing. Well, you can in this very vague sense, right? Is that a thing? But there we're talking about something really intangible and degrees to which it's well known. That's not what we mean here. A second thing is that substances admit of contrary qualities. Substances can at one time have a certain quality and then later have another quality. So what's a good example of that? One thing that at different times has contrary qualities. Now presumably it can't happen at one time. I can't be both tall and short at once. Though I could be tall for, gosh, what? Yeah, I'd be tall for, well, but I'm not a child, so it's hard to think about. Let's see. Well, I said I'm short for my family, right? But I might be tall for, actually, when I lived in New England, I said tall. New Englanders are sort of big. But anyway, yeah, you could say, look, you're tall, or for example, a mouse. Something might be large for a mouse, but small for an animal. That's a really easy case. However, we can't have something being large and small in the same sense, with reference to the same class, at the same time. So can you think of examples where the same thing actually has contrary qualities, but at different times? Yeah?
Like a person can be happy one day and upset.
Exactly. You can be happy one day and then upset the next one, right? Being happy and upset, you can't be that at the same time, but you could be happy at one moment and sad or upset or angry at another moment. Yeah.
That's like an ice cube. At one point it's solid, and then after a while it's water.
Excellent. An ice cube, it melts. And so initially it's solid, but then after a while it's liquid. Okay? So that's an example of something that has contrary qualities. It's not solid and liquid at the same time, but it's solid now, and then as it melts it becomes liquid. That's a good example of something that has contrary qualities. But now, what about some of these other categories? White. Let's see, it's a color right now. Are there times when white is not color? Or what about 6 feet tall? Is it ever other than what it is? Does it ever admit contrary qualities? What about being west of Austin? That sort of stays the same, right? So it doesn't admit contrary qualities in the same kind of way. Well, so far we've been looking at aspects of Aristotle's categorical scheme, and Aristotle's answer to the question, answer is, there are substances. Okay, in the primary sense, there are individual substances. This is. And then in the secondary sense, there are kinds of substance. Those are the fundamental senses, but then, of course, there are quantities, qualities, relations, etc., etc. I want to look at a different categorical scheme that is an attempt to answer the question, what is there, in a different context. The same question arises in classical Indian metaphysics, and we can look at a different kind of answer. In general, Indian metaphysics centers on the question of realism versus idealism. Are things in the world independent of our minds, or are they all dependent on our own mental constructions? Buddhism, as well as the most popular school of Hinduism, actually embrace idealism. They think that everything is really a mental construction. So they insist everything is mind-dependent. The world is something of a projection of our minds. However, there are schools of Indian thought that we've already looked at last time that hold the contrary view, that are realist, and think that at least some things are independent of the mind. Now, everybody agrees that some things might be mind-dependent. Things like dreams, desires, ideas, those are mind-dependent. The real question is whether anything has a different character and is really out there independently of us. Well, we're going to look at the Hindu philosophers of the logic and the particularist schools, Nyaya and Vaisesika, and we're going to examine their realist metaphysics because they start with this question too, what is there? And they think there really are objects out there in the world independently of us. And that those include common sense objects like rocks, trees, stone. Why did I say rocks and stones? What's the difference between rocks and stones? I don't know. I was just on a roll. Anyway, these objects in no sense depend on our minds. Okay, they are not projections of our minds, they're not constructions of our mind. They're really out there. And they endure over time. They are the kinds of things that are out there and stay there and therefore can admit contrary qualities. That cube of ice can melt and so take on a contrary quality. That person can be happy one day and sad the next. Now, one thinker who proceeds to give a categorical scheme within this framework is Kavanaugh. I will enumerate everything that has the character of being, it says, around the year 100. So he's addressing the fundamental question of metaphysics. Or this part of metaphysics is often referred to as ontology, from the Greek ont, which means being, and then ology, study of. So it's the study of being, ontology. And he's asking, what is there? And like Aristotle, saying everyday speech and behavior is the touchstone. That's where we start. We begin with language and we see what people talk about. If we want to know what there is there in the world, we could just look around, but we can also say, well, what do people say that there is? What do people talk about? Maybe that's a good indication of what there really is in the world, the kinds of things people discuss. And so he introduces a scheme of categories, padartha, in the Sanskrit, types of things to which words refer. So we looked at Aristotle's scheme and said, what are the categories of? Kinds of thing, kinds of fundamental thing, kinds of being. And here we've got an answer to that right at the outset. We're talking about kinds of things to which words refer. Kinds of reference, in other words. Kinds of things denoted in language. Well, what are these things that are designated in language? What kinds of things do we talk about? What kinds of things do we refer to? Answer is, initially, there are three kinds of things. Okay? There are substances, like pot, or cloth, fire, soul. Those are examples taken from the Hindu texts themselves. So that's a little bit different from Aristotle's examples, but you get the same idea. We've got substances, either individual things or kinds of things. Then we've got qualities, like square, blue, white, tall, etc. And then we've got motions or actions, like move, eat, or throw. Now once again we can see the grammatical categories here. Pot, cloth, fire, soul are all nouns, yes. Square, blue, white, tall, those are all adjectives, yes. Move, eat, throw, all verbs, exactly. So those correspond to items in Aristotle's categories. We've got substances, we've got qualities, we've got actions. And so all of those are things already recognized by, well, I shouldn't say already recognized by Aristotle. Oh, well, yes, Aristotle was writing about 400 years before this. They are described as existing. Okay, in the Sanskrit, sa. They exist. These are things that have being of some kind. But now are those the only things? Well, of course, there are 7 categories that Aristotle includes along with these. So Aristotle's answer would be, no, those aren't the only kinds of things. Substances are the most fundamental kind, but then there are a variety of others in addition to qualities and actions. There are affections, there are positions, there are times and places and states and so on. Now, eventually, in this Nyaya-Vaisesika tradition, there are 4 additional categories introduced. But they're interesting because they are not ones that appear in Aristotle's prayer. They're fundamentally different kinds of things. And so I find it fascinating that exactly the same question, really, is raised in 2 isolated traditions, and overlapping answers are given, but not entirely overlapping. There are interesting differences. So here are some of the additional categories. First of all, universality. Things like triangularity, friendship, love. What are those, grammatically speaking? Communication. Squareness. They're just abstract nouns, okay? So these are references to universals or properties. And we'll come back later to what that exactly means. A second category, inherence. The pots being blue, our losing the battle. My being sort of tall. Okay? Those are examples of a quality inhering in a substance. Later, philosophers sometimes refer to these as tropes. Something's having a certain quality. Something's standing in a certain relation. Then there are individualizers. These are things that differentiate the atoms. It supplies the this part. Now, when we think about people and tables and snowflakes, it's not too hard to worry about what makes it that person or that snowflake or even that table, because the properties of the table is different. But think about a bunch of things that are otherwise identical. Think about the Dixie cups being made at the Dixie Cup factory. They're all pretty much the same, right? Boom, 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 boom. They get stamped out by the machine. They all look just alike. In fact, it would be very strange to think, how do you know that cup's yours? And to say, oh, well, you know, I looked for the cutest one. They're all just alike, right? And yet something makes that Dixie cup different from that Dixie cup. Or if you want a more scientific instance, think about various electrons. There are lots and lots of different electrons, even in one single atom. But what makes one electron different from another electron? They have exactly the same qualities, don't they? And so they look like they're just qualitatively identical. They're in different spots, maybe. They have different velocities at a given time, and so on, maybe. However, if we think about the electrons, we start realizing, well, something must make it that electron as opposed to this electron. And so we might think there has to be something that differentiates them. And those are the individualizers. Those are these little atoms, or later they get called bare particulars, that somehow have the qualities and make things different, even when they have exactly the same qualities. And then finally, my favorite category, absences, lacks, okay? Like the elephant. There is no elephant in here, right? So I look around, I'm seeing the absence of an elephant. Okay, now, the first 3 of these are present, according to this tradition. The last is weird. It is not present. It is an absence, okay? But nevertheless, don't be distracted by that. There are absences in the world. In fact, there's a wonderful article by David Lewis and Stephanie Lewis called Holes, in which they debate the question, are there holes? And one answer is, of course there are holes, like Swiss cheese is full of them. Another answer is, that's ridiculous. A hole's in the thing, okay? There's the cheese, but then, you know, what's the hole? It's just where there's no cheese. It's not like a hole is a thing in the world that you have to count. If you were saying, what are the things in this room? You would count the chairs, you would count the people, you would count the computers. You wouldn't say, oh, and yeah, there are the absent elephants, and the absent antelopes, and the absent cats, and the absent mice, and the absent rats. And you wouldn't count all of that, would you? And so, it can look strange. Is an absence a thing that we have to include in what there is in the world, or is it just something not used in? In any case, it says they all could be talked about, they all could be named. I could refer to the absence of an elephant in the room. I could talk about the absence of a certain thing, the dog that didn't bark in the nighttime, in the famous Sherlock Holmes example. And so absences are things we can refer to. So let's talk a little more about each of these. What is inherence? Well, it's the relation that holds between a substance and a quality. So I am, or for that matter, a substance and an activity, a substance and a state, a substance and a position. So I am, for example, right now, a man. Well, I hope, right now, it's not like it's going to change tomorrow, I hope. But anyway, I am a man, and so you might say, yes, that is a actually, that's not a good example, because there I'm referring to a kind, so I'm still in the realm of secondary substance. I am tall. Let's adopt that fiction. Then I can say tallness is something that inheres in me. Okay? I am human, so humanity is something that inheres in me. I have the quality of being a teacher, and so teaching is something that adheres to me. Or being a teacher, anyway, is something that adheres to me. So this is a relationship between the thing and the qualities that it has. What about individualizers? Max Black, a 20th century philosopher, gives this example. Imagine a universe with two iron spheres, and those are the only things that exist in that entire universe. And they move around one another in perfect symmetry. What differentiates one sphere from the other? Well, you can't really refer to any quality that they have that the other couldn't be described as having, especially if you think of space and time as in some way relative here. They look qualitatively identical. Nevertheless, they're different. And what distinguishes them? That's a kind of argument that there must be something that makes it this sphere as opposed to that sphere. There must be a bare this, and that would be an individualizer. What about absences? Look at the slide. What do I have on that slide under the heading absence? Nothing. You can talk about nothing, and gosh, to refer to nothing, you have to refer to an absence, right? There's an absence of anything of that sort. Okay. See, it's so silly. I'm really proud of that slide. The easiest one to make up, but anyway. It's obvious what would make there's an elephant in the room true. Here's a picture of an example. There's an elephant in that room. Or in this room, standing on a little table. But what would make there is no elephant in the room true? Well, it would be the absence of an elephant. Or at least that's one possible answer, and so we have to refer to absences here. By the way, there is a phrase now, the elephant in the room, which just means some obvious thing that nobody's talking about, that's being overlooked. And the origin of that usage is from George Berkeley, a philosopher who challenged scientists to a debate on whether or not there was an invisible elephant in the room. So it's unconnected to this ancient Indian usage. Now, here's an interesting sort of question. I can give you a story about how we know something about substances. I come into contact with substances all the time. I can tell you a story maybe about how I know something about qualities, because those substances have qualities, and I observe those qualities in those substances around me. But what about things like universals? They are things that inhere in those substances. Can I know about the universals in the same way? What about this inherence relation itself? I don't see that in the same way that I see the substance. I see the pot. But do I see the pots being glue? Maybe. Maybe I can tell you a story about that. What about these particularizers? The thing that makes it that Dixie cup or that iron sphere? Well, I really don't perceive that. After all the qualities of things I perceive are between the spheres identical. And the same with the Dixie cups. And yet I can talk about this one or that one. And so something must make that possible, and yet it's not something I perceive. And what about absences? I certainly don't perceive an elephant in the room. And so absences seem like the kind of thing I can't perceive at all. So of course I can look around and I don't see an elephant in the room. But I don't see any oxygen in the room either. And I conclude there's no oxygen in the room. So there's something strange going on with that. Well, anyway, I'll come back to this later. Too complicated. When I talk about that, nobody ever understands it. It's the key theme of my dissertation from untold many years ago. But no one ever understands it. Anyway, like Aristotle, the Nyaya-Vaisesika thinkers, all these other categories depend on substance. Even the absences I've got to say there is no elephant in the room. Even if I say there is nothing in the room, that really ends up meaning there is no substance in the room. And so all the categories really depend in some way on substance, just as in Aristotle. Qualities are qualities of substances. Motions are motions of substances. Absences are absences of substances, and so forth. Now there are kinds of non-composite substances, so we can start dividing things, as Aristotle does, between the living and the non-living, and then the animate and the inanimate, and the rational and the irrational. But they give us a different and more traditional kind of this differentiation. Basic substances, the kinds of substances that are really fundamental, and all other substances are put together out of, are earth, air, fire, water, and ether. And so they introduce here a kind of thing that appears later in the West in medieval thought, and of course has become the periodic table that we see in chemistry and physics classrooms, where we end up saying, all right, fine, the kinds of things there are substances, let's say, but what are the most basic kinds of substance? What are the fundamental kinds of substance out of which all other substances are made? And the Indian answer here, in Nyaya-Vaisesika anyway, is this: earth, air, fire, water, and then the ether. The ether being basically the container of whatever fills empty space is the ether. And we combine these in various ways to produce every other substance. So, ye old periodic table. Earth, water, air, and fire, and then that blank space, that's the ether. Now, that is one way of looking at things. Our modern way of thinking about ontology and answering the questions of metaphysics is at this level a lot more sophisticated. And we have more than 100 of these basic elements, basic components, and then we can look even further inside atoms and say, well, actually, even those things are composites of more fundamental things. And maybe physics hasn't yet told us one of the most fundamental things. But there is a part of ontology that gives us big categorical schemes, like the ones we've been talking about. And then there's another part that says, well, and the things that are most fundamental there, out of which they are made, are ultimately these kinds of things. And then philosophy starts looking a lot like physics. And physical theories and philosophical theories end up